By 5:40 a.m., the mountain fog was still hanging low over the quarantine row, and Dan Fletcher already had blood on his sleeve. Not much, just a thin rust-coloured smear from Pairav's upper jaw when the tiger jerked away from the squeeze chute and struck the bars with a hollow clang. But it was enough to turn Dan's stomach because he knew that blood wasn't from a fresh cut. It was from a tooth that had been dying in Pairav's head for months. "Easy, old man," Dan said softly, one hand on the gate latch, body angled out of reach, but close enough that Pairav could see him. "Nobody's taking your face off today, just helping." Pairav answered with a low growl that never rose to full threat. Pain had worn him down too far for theatrics. 17 years old, 240 pounds lighter than he should have been, and still broad-shouldered enough to make new volunteers forget how to breathe the first time he looked at them. His orange coat had dulled into burnished copper over the years, stripes blurred where old scars pulled skin tight. The left side of his face was swollen beneath the eye, the fur there matted from drainage. Every few minutes he worked his jaw and then froze, as if the movement lit a fuse in his skull. Blue Ridge Predator Rescue didn't get easy cats. It got leftovers. Elderly circus tigers with arthritic hips and track callous paws. Photo prop cubs bought by men who liked posting big cat selfies more than buying raw meat. Confiscation cases that arrived with paperwork so thin it looked intentional. If an accredited zoo had a reason to say no, Blue Ridge was usually the number it passed along, quietly, after hours with legal disclaimers attached. Dan ran field operations, which sounded administrative on grant applications, and meant, in reality, everything from transport planning to emergency sedation to calming furious county officials who thought sanctuary was just a prettier word for private zoo. He kept one eye on animal welfare, one eye on cash flow, and one eye, impossibly, on regulators waiting for a misstep big enough to justify shutting them down. In his world, every syringe had a budget line and a potential headline. Today's plan had been painfully simple on paper. Sedate Pairav, pull the rotten upper canine, flush the abscess, place antibiotics, recover, monitor. Give him a chance to sleep without grinding his jaw against steel mesh all night. They had delayed twice already. First for weather, then for staffing. The state required a full sedation team for geriatric cats. The dental unit had to be borrowed. The anesthetic drugs had to be logged to the milligram, witnessed, signed, and co-signed. If Dan had learned anything in 13 years at Blue Ridge, it was that straightforward medicine in a tiger was never straightforward in a sanctuary. At 6:10, the medical trailer lights clicked on one by one. Dr. Lena Morales arrived with her hair still damp from a rushed shower and a thermos that smelled like burnt coffee. Malik, their senior vet tech, rolled in portable oxygen and checked the intubation tray like he was counting ammunition. A volunteer named Sienna set warm IV fluids in a circulating bath and read out inventory while Dan signed chain of custody forms for controlled sedatives. Outside, donors were waking up to the sanctuary's scheduled post. Bhairav's dental day. Send strength to our old king. There was a smiling photo from last spring when his face looked almost symmetrical, and he still accepted goat chunks from tongs. The comments were full of crown emojis and prayer hands and people promising $20 if the big guy did well. Dan stared at that photo longer than he should have. Back then, Pairav had still chuffed at him in the mornings. Now the tiger barely tolerated eye contact. "You good?" Lena asked, snapping on nitrile gloves. "Depends," Dan said. "You want the honest answer, or the one I give our board?" She huffed a laugh, but her eyes stayed on Pairav. "Honest. I think if we wait another week, we lose him anyway." Lena nodded once. "Then we don't wait." They moved with the quiet choreography of people who had rehearsed bad outcomes enough times to avoid naming them. Pyrav entered the shift pen for a baited target and gave Dan one brief, suspicious look before lowering his head towards the meat. The dart struck deep in the shoulder. A minute later came the second. 5 minutes after that, his hindquarters wavered. At 8, he went down with a soft exhale that sounded almost embarrassed. Dan was first through the safety gate once Lena gave clearance. He knelt near Pyrav's head, palm resting against warm, striped fur while Malik secured the airway. Pulse ox, ECG leads, IV line, rectal temp. The machine beeps formed a synthetic heartbeat around the tiger's very real one. Depth is good, Lena said. Jaw tone? Minimal, Malik answered. Dan lifted Pyrav's upper lip with gloved fingers and saw the damage up close. The right upper canine was dark at the gum line, fractured years ago and now loosened in infected tissue. Pus tracked along the root. No wonder he had stopped eating chunks and switched to soft mash. No wonder he had started pacing after midnight, pressing his muzzle to bars as if trying to grind the pain off. Lena looked over his shoulder. We'll get this out and he'll feel 10 years younger. Dan gave a tight nod. Hope was always dangerous at Blue Ridge, but he let himself take 1 inch of it. Because this was the part of rescue work people didn't see in fundraising videos. Not the dramatic confiscation, not the triumphant release into grass, but the slow, bureaucratic triage of damaged bodies. The signatures. The supplies bought late with personal credit cards. The weeks when one sick animal could consume every staff hour and still die. He stood as Malik prepped for imaging. Protocol for geriatric sedation, pre-op chest and abdominal films, even on routine dentistry. Catch hidden issues before anesthesia deepened. Most of the time, the extra x-rays just confirmed arthritis and old rib fractures from former lives no one could fully document. Most of the time. By 7:02 a.m., Pyrav lay on his side in the radiology bay, paws tucked, tube secured, breath fogging faintly inside the anesthesia circuit. Sienna slid the plate beneath him. Lena called settings. Malik stepped back behind shielding with the hand switch. Exposure in 3, he said. 2, 1. The click was small and ordinary. The screen bloomed grey-white with vertebrae, ribs, the soft, dark chambers of lung. Then a knot of brightness flashed into view low in the abdomen, so dense and irregular it looked, for 1 disorienting second, like someone had dropped a clenched metal fist inside the tiger. No one spoke. Lena leaned forward until her nose almost touched the monitor. What is that? Malik frowned. Artifact? Take another angle, she said. They did. Then another. The same shape appeared each time. A compact circular cluster of metallic opacities packed beneath and slightly behind the stomach, dozens of fragments layered together in a rough sphere. Not 1 object, not 2. Too many pieces to count quickly. Too organized to be random debris and gut contents. Too bright, too old-looking, as if corrosion had fused edges. Dan heard his own voice come out flat. Could he have swallowed... What? A chain? Lena shook her head slowly. Not like this, Sienna whispered. Is that buckshot? No entry pattern. No spread like ballistic fragments, Lena said, but she sounded less certain with each word. She scrolled between images, adjusted contrast, zoomed. And this is abdominal, not thoracic. If this were recent trauma, we'd expect free air, acute inflammation, something obvious. Dan stared at the image until the pixels burned. He had read Pyrav's transfer records a dozen times. Circus holding to roadside attraction to confiscation intake. Malnutrition notes, parasites, healed lash marks around the neck, chronic dental disease. Nothing about abdominal surgery. Nothing about foreign objects. No mention of gunshot injury. No mention of anything that could explain a metallic mass living in a tiger for years. "How unstable does this make him?" he asked. Lena did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. She tapped one bright edge near the stomach silhouette. "I don't know if this is intragastric, embedded in wall, adhered to omentum. I don't know if there's old scar tissue containing it, or if one shift under anesthesia tears something we can't repair here." Dan felt the day fold in on itself. "The tooth? If we proceed blind and he decompensates, we've killed him to fix a canine." She met his eyes. "I can't justify that." He wanted to argue. Pyrav was already in pain, already under. Every delay had a cost. But he knew the math, and Lena wasn't cautious by temperament. If she was calling it, the risk was real. "Abort dentistry," she said quietly to the room. "We recover and reassess." The words landed like a dropped cinder block. Sienna turned away, jaw clenched. Malik swore under his breath, then began switching protocols with rigid efficiency. Lower gas. Reverse agent staged. Warmth support. Monitor for rough wake-up. Dan walked out into the corridor because if he stayed another second, he might punch the drywall. Outside, morning had broken clean and bright over the ridgeline. Somewhere near the prep kitchen, a volunteer laughed at something on a phone, the sound sharp and absurd against the echo in his ears. He pulled his own phone from his pocket. 3 missed calls already. 2 from administration. 1 from a board member who only called when costs were about to jump. He pressed call back as he re-entered the trailer. It was Nora Klein, Blue Ridge's finance chair, voice clipped before greetings. "Tell me this is still dental and not abdominal surgery." Dan watched through the glass while Malik adjusted Pyrav's airway and Lena monitored capnography. "It's not still dental." Silence. Then, "How bad?" "Unknown metallic foreign body cluster. Abdomen. Dentistry cancelled." Nora inhaled slowly, that particular breath of someone reading spreadsheets in her head. "Dan, we do not have exploratory surgery money without diagnosis. We're 6 weeks from payroll compression. If this becomes a referral case..." "He's in pain now." "I know. But we can't authorize an open abdomen on probabilities." He ended the call before his temper got them both fired. By the time Bhairav began to surface, the first social media message had already gone up. Procedure postponed due to unexpected findings. More soon. Within 20 minutes, comments split into familiar factions. Supportive donors asked what was needed. Armchair experts insisted the rescue had missed obvious symptoms. A local critic account posted, "They sedated a geriatric tiger without proper diagnostics. Negligence dressed up as compassion." Dan muted notifications and failed to stop reading anyway. Pyrav's recovery was rough. He woke disoriented, growling around thick saliva, forelimbs paddling against restraints. The abscess still pulsed beneath his eye, untouched. They extubated only when he could swallow, then watched him lurch into sternal position and blink as if betrayed. Dan stayed at the barrier until Bhairav regained enough coordination to move into the padded den. He did not look at Dan once. At 11:30, the state inspector emailed a formal request for a written risk management plan within 24 hours, citing unexpected radiographic abnormalities in a sedated geriatric Panthera tigris. Bureaucratic phrasing, legal teeth. They wanted sedation rationale, contingency protocols, referral timeline, and welfare mitigation, while definitive care was pending. At noon, Lena sent the radiographs to a consulting radiologist in Raleigh. Preliminary response came back 38 minutes later and somehow made things worse. Complex metallic foreign body aggregation. Differential includes chronic ingestion with retention, Penetrating fragments with fibrous encapsulation? Less likely neoplastic mineralization. Cannot exclude intermittent perforation or occult hemorrhage. Recommend advanced imaging and surgical consult urgently. Urgently, with no certainty. Dan spent the afternoon in the records office, a converted storage room that smelled of printer toner and old hay. He dug through Pyrav's custody chain again, this time not for veterinary notes, but for maintenance logs from the roadside attraction where Pyrav had spent 9 years. Most documents were scanned badly, stamped and incomplete. But in the third PDF set, he found work orders. Catwalk bolt replacement, mesh panel refastened, feeding gate hinge loose, shop floor sweep pending, repeated across months. One handwritten incident report mentioned rush feed tossed from prep area due to show delay. Tossed from prep area. Onto what kind of floor? Near what debris? Nails, staples, clipped wire. He printed the pages and spread them across the desk, building timelines with a yellow marker until they looked like conspiracy evidence. At 3:15, his assistant knocked and held out her phone. "You should see this." The message was from Ridgeway Exotics, a better-funded private facility 2 states over that had never stopped trying to poach Blue Ridge donors under the language of partnership. Heard about Pyrav. We can absorb case immediately if BRPR lacks surgical capacity. Happy to coordinate transfer and public messaging. Public messaging. Dan almost laughed. Translation. Hand over your most visible tiger and watch your donor base follow him. He typed no response. Evening rounds were quiet except for Pyrav. He ignored minced turkey, ignored enriched broth, ignored pain meds hidden in blood jelly. He drank a little, then turned his head to the wall. Every refusal tightened the timeline. A tiger his age could not run a prolonged calorie deficit and fight infection indefinitely. Lena joined Dan at the enclosure window, arms folded against the dropping temperature. "He needs that tooth out," she said, "but until we know what that mass is, anesthesia is roulette. We don't have time for leisurely diagnostics." "I know." Behind them, a radio crackled with a volunteer requesting lock access to the south service lane. Somewhere farther off, one of the lions gave a hoarse, dusk roar. Dan rubbed both hands over his face and forced himself into operational mode. "Okay, tonight we stabilize pain. Tomorrow first light, I chase every former owner record, every ex-staff contact, every imaging consult from here to California. We build a defensible plan before the state comes down on us." "And if all we get is maybe?" Lena asked. He looked through the glass at Pyrav, who stood now only because instinct told him standing hurt less than lying on his face. The tiger's breathing was slow, deliberate, endurance breathing. "Then I decide whether to cut on maybe," Dan said. He didn't add the rest out loud. Whether to spend money they didn't have, risk a death they might not survive politically, and sign his name beneath all of it. At Blue Ridge, caring was never the hard part. Choosing which risk could kill you first. That was the job. Lena stayed beside him at the glass a few seconds longer, then said, "I'll redraw analgesia and add a gut protectant. If he won't take oral, we go injectable through the barrier at midnight." Dan nodded. "I'll be an admin." "You'll be everywhere," she said, not unkindly. He gave her a tired look that counted as agreement and headed across the gravel yard toward the main office, boots crunching frost. The sanctuary after dark always sounded bigger than it looked, chain link ticking as it cooled, distant huffs from cats settling in, the faint drone of highway trucks miles away. Usually those sounds calmed him. Tonight, they felt like a clock. Inside the admin building smelled like copier heat and reheated soup. 2 volunteers sat at the front desk, moderating comments and answering donor emails with pre-approved language. "Pyrav is stable. Team is consulting specialists. Thank you for support. The younger one looked up as Dan passed. Do you want us to hide the negligence comments? Hide threats. Leave criticism unless it's doxing staff, Dan said. We don't look scared. Upstairs, he opened a blank document titled BayRav Risk Plan, State Response, and started typing with the clipped precision of someone writing for people eager to find fault. Sedation indication. Pre-op protocols followed. Unexpected radiographic finding. Immediate procedure abort rationale. Current pain management strategy. Monitoring frequency. Consultation timeline. Emergency referral criteria. He attached vital sheets, drug logs, radiographs, and Lena's signed clinical notes. At 9:14 p.m., his phone buzzed with a state number. Fletcher, he answered. Inspector Hargrove, said the voice. I'm reviewing your initial notice. We need clearer transport contingencies. We're drafting now. You have less than 12 hours. Given the age of the animal and unknown abdominal risk, the department may require referral to a tertiary centre. May require, Dan repeated carefully, or recommend. A pause. Don't split language with me, Mr. Fletcher. If this tiger dies during delayed treatment, we'll examine whether your facility exceeded its medical capacity. Dan looked at the radiograph on his screen, the bright clustered knot like a fistful of stars gone wrong. Understood. When the call ended, he sat very still for a second, then forwarded the updated plan to Lena and copied legal. At 9:40, Nora Klein called again, this time with no preamble. I ran numbers. If we do referral imaging plus exploratory surgery, we burn through unrestricted reserves. If the outcome is poor, we're in emergency austerity by quarter end. He's already in poor outcome territory. I'm not arguing medicine, I'm arguing survivability of the institution that treats 37 other carnivores. Dan pinched the bridge of his nose. Then help me survive both. I need a diagnosis I can defend to the board, Nora said. Not maybe perforation, maybe not. I'm working on it. Work faster. He disconnected before anger turned into something less useful. By 10:30, he had 3 more specialist replies and no clarity. One said the cluster looked chronic and likely walled off. Another warned that any manipulation may destabilize encapsulated foreign material. A third suggested CT before surgery, then added that prolonged anesthesia for imaging in a debilitated geriatric tiger carried substantial mortality risk. No one wanted to own the call. At 11:05, Malik radioed from quarantine. Pyrav refused second offer. No interest in rabbit puree either. Hydration. Drank maybe 200 milliliters. He's restless. Dan shut his laptop and went back out. Bahirav was pacing a short L shape between the den threshold and the far wall, jaw held slightly open. Each turn was stiff, deliberate. He paused when Dan approached, nostrils flaring, then looked through him as if deciding whether he still belonged in the category of trusted things. Lena drew up medication at the barrier port. He's guarding his abdomen now, not just his face, she said quietly. It may be nausea, it may be pain radiating, or both. What if we sedate for ultrasound? In this body condition, with this unknown, we might not wake him cleanly, and gas in gut will degrade half of what we need anyway. Dan watched Pyrav lower himself onto his sternum, then immediately rise again as if the ground had become hostile. He's telling us he can't wait. I know, Lena said. At midnight, the sanctuary posted a second update. Pyrav remains under close veterinary care while we consult additional experts. Donations surged for 20 minutes. Then a regional wildlife blogger posted screenshots of old USDA citations from facilities unrelated to Blue Ridge, but tagged them as private sanctuary pattern. Comments turned ugly fast. This is why big cats should never be in private hands. You sedated him for PR content. Transfer him to professionals. Dan skimmed until his vision blurred, then tossed the phone onto the passenger seat of the Gator and drove to records. The records office gave him a different kind of headache. Faded scans, redacted names, invoices that looked photocopied 10 times. He built Peyrav's timeline from confiscation to circus subcontract to roadside attraction, then backward to a broker in Missouri that no longer existed. The farther back he went, the less language there was around veterinary care and the more around asset transfer. At 1:32 a.m., he found a maintenance binder scan from the roadside attraction with a handwritten note in the margin of a feeding log. "Keep magnets away from prep table," M yelled again. No context, no explanation, just that one line. He stared at it. Magnets in a tiger prep area. He printed the page, circled the line, and added it to a growing stack that already included loose fastener reports and floor sweep delays. It could have meant nothing. It could have meant everything. By 2:15 a.m., exhaustion made his hands shake enough that he switched from coffee to water and started making calls no one sensible answers at that hour. First to an old USDA contact who no longer worked enforcement. Voicemail. Then to a former transport driver listed in Peyrav's confiscation file. Disconnected. Then to a number labeled Marta J. Ex-keeper. 2018 interview. It rang 6 times. A woman answered, voice thick with sleep and suspicion. "Who is this?" "Dan Fletcher, Blue Ridge Predator Rescue. Sorry for the hour. This is about Peyrav, the tiger confiscated from Carson Wildlife Adventure in 2019. You gave a statement." Silence, then a rustle of sheets. "What happened to him?" "He's alive. We found a metallic mass in his abdomen during pre-op imaging. I'm trying to understand exposure history. Anything about him ingesting hardware, chain, tools?" "No. Too fast. We swept pens. I found repeated logs for loose fasteners and delayed floor cleaning in prep areas. That place logged whatever made them look less negligent than they were." Her voice sharpened. Feeding during show season was chaos. Meat buckets tipped onto whatever surface was nearest. "Any reason magnets would be near prep?" Another silence, longer this time. "Where did you hear magnets?" she asked. "Handwritten note in maintenance records." Marta exhaled. "I signed papers. I'm not supposed to—" "He may die without this," Dan said. He hated deploying it, but it was true. She cursed softly. Trainers had stupid tricks. One guy kept a magnet puck in his pocket because the workshop floor had nails and wire snippets from cage repairs. Said if he dropped meat, he could clean it quick by dragging the magnet through sawdust before throwing food. Like that made it safe. Dan sat forward. He put the magnet in the meat. Sometimes wrapped in plastic if they were rushing. Sometimes not. Sometimes I think they forgot where they set it. She sounded sick now. "You're telling me?" "I'm telling you, I have a tiger full of metal and no map yet." "I'm sorry," she whispered, and hung up. Dan looked at the dark window over his desk, his own reflection pale and hollow-eyed. Anecdote wasn't diagnosis, but it was a thread. At 3:04 a.m., another complication arrived in the form of an email from Ridgway Exotics, this time copied to 2 journalists and a donor liaison. Given reports of delayed intervention, Ridgway reiterates willingness to assume immediate custody for advanced surgical management. Dan said something profane to the empty room. 5 minutes later, his communications coordinator texted, "Reporter from Channel 8 asking if State is investigating." "What do I say?" He typed back. "State oversight is standard in complex medical cases. Peyrav remains under veterinary supervision. No transfer planned." At 3:40, Malik called again from quarantine. He retched, no output except foam. "Vitals? Heart rate up, temp holding. He's responsive but agitated. Dan grabbed his jacket and ran. Lena was already there, hair pulled into a knot that had half fallen out. She watched Paherav through the panel while timing breaths. It may be nausea from pain meds. Another possibility is gastric irritation. There may also be pressure from that mass. We're threading needles and hoping he doesn't move. Can we increase fluids? Cautiously, he's not in kidney failure, but overdo it and we stress everything else. They administered antiemetic and adjusted pain control through the protected port. Paherav tolerated the poke with a low, exhausted rumble, then pressed himself into the corner and shut his eyes without sleeping. By dawn, Dan had been awake nearly 28 hours. The fog had returned denser than yesterday, pressing the sanctuary into a muted grey bowl. Staff moved like ghosts between enclosures. The day shift arrived to a whiteboard full of red underlines. At 6:20 a.m., the consulting radiologist called for a verbal follow-up. "I reviewed all views again," he said. "Pattern suggests long-standing metal aggregation. Could be adhered near pyloric outflow or proximal duodenum, but plain films are limited. If this were my case, I'd want CT." "We can't safely run prolonged imaging and then a second anesthesia later," Dan said. "Then you're choosing between incomplete information and no intervention. Give me your best probability of catastrophic event if we wait 48 hours. A sigh. "I can't quantify from radiographs, but with anorexia, ongoing pain and signs of GI distress, waiting is not neutral." When he hung up, Dan sent the risk plan to the state at 6:58, 2 minutes before deadline. At 7:12, Hargrove replied, "Received. Department expects documented specialist consultation and definitive care pathway by end of day." Definitive pathway, not maybe. Dan stood in the corridor outside quarantine, staring at Pahirav's den camera feed on his tablet. The tiger hadn't touched food. He'd licked water once. His left flank twitched with each breath. Lena came up beside him with 2 paper cups of coffee. "You look embalmed." "Compliment accepted." She handed him a cup. "I talked to NC State Surgery Intake. Earliest transfer slot for CT plus possible abdominal is tomorrow afternoon. They can't guarantee immediate OR access." Tomorrow afternoon is a year away. They drank in silence for a moment. Then Dan said, "Who do you call when the experts won't call it?" Lena frowned. "Meaning?" "Someone who's seen weird metal ingestion patterns in large animals, not tigers. Anything," she thought. "There's a retired bovine vet in Ashe County, Cal Whitcomb. Used to lecture on hardware disease in cattle." "Why?" Dan was already opening his contacts. "Because I'm done waiting for perfect species match." Whitcomb answered on the 3rd ring with a gravelly, "Yeah?" Dan introduced himself, gave the compressed version, then emailed radiographs while still on the call. There was a long minute of keyboard clatter, and one muttered, "Huh." "You there?" Dan asked. "I'm here," Whitcomb said. "Son, you said tiger." "Yes. Because if you'd told me this was a dairy cow, I'd say hardware disease around a retained magnet and ask why we're still talking." Dan felt the world narrow to a single, clear line. "Say that again." "Hardware disease. Cattle swallow nails, bits of wire. We give rumen magnets so metal sticks instead of migrating through tissue. Your image, this cluster, it's organized around something central, high-density core. Looks like a magnet with years of junk accreted onto it." "In a tiger stomach." "Biology doesn't care about your taxonomic pride. If there's a magnet and loose metal, same physics applies." Whitcomb paused. "Question is whether it's been walled off and stable, or whether now it's irritating, ulcerating, threatening perforation." Dan turned toward Lena, who had gone utterly still, listening to his side of the call and reading his face. "What would trigger decline after years?" Dan asked. Inflammation shifts. Scar tissue fails. One sharp fragment rotates. Infection elsewhere tips the balance. You said he's got a dental abscess? Systemic stress can wake old devils. Dan scribbled notes hard enough to tear the page. Treatment? If symptomatic and deteriorating, surgical removal. And if you're anesthetizing a 17-year-old tiger, you do every necessary procedure in one window, or you may not get another. When the call ended, Dan stood motionless for half a breath, then moved fast. First stop, records. He pulled confiscation intake photos and zoomed on Bhairav from his roadside years. Most were poor quality, but in one side profile from a show-holding area, Bhairav wore a crude leather training collar with a rectangular bulge stitched near the throat latch. Not decorative, not ID hardware. A pouch. He printed it and ran to Lena. Second stop, phones. He called Marta back, then another former handler whose name appeared in labour records. The second man, after 10 minutes of denial and legal hedging, admitted trainers had used a strong shop magnet as a clean-up shortcut before performances. Sometimes in a rag, sometimes in a meat scrap, the man said. They said it kept cats from swallowing sharp junk if they dropped food. Did it ever go missing? Dan asked. More than once, the man said quietly. Nobody wanted to be the one to report it. By 9:05 a.m., Dan had a working mechanism. Magnet introduced during feeding chaos, likely swallowed, retained, progressively trapping metallic fragments over years until scar tissue encapsulated a growing bezoar. Hidden, tolerated, then destabilized. Not guesswork anymore, not perfect certainty, but a coherent path that explained the radiographs, the chronicity, and the sudden decline. He found Lena in treatment, loading syringes. We have it, he said. She looked up sharply. Tell me. He gave her Whitcomb's interpretation, the collar photo, Marta's statement, the second confirmation. As he spoke, Lena's expression shifted from skepticism to grim recognition. Hardware disease analog, she said. In a tiger. Jesus. Can you defend surgery on that basis? With consult notes and supporting history? Yes. She set the syringes down. And if this is right, waiting is worse than cutting. Dan nodded once. Then we do abdominal removal and dental extraction under one anesthetic. Lena met his eyes. That's a brutal plan. It's the only plan that isn't slow-motion euthanasia. Outside, Bhairav gave a low, rough cough from his den, then went quiet. Dan picked up his phone and opened a new group thread. Nora, board chair, legal, transport lead, university surgery contact. Subject, urgent, definitive diagnosis. Pathway for Bhairav. His thumbs hovered for half a second before he typed. We have a probable mechanism explaining radiographic mass. Retained magnet with chronic metal aggregation. Consult attached. Bhairav is declining clinically and not eating. Recommendation: emergency abdominal surgery plus concurrent canine extraction in single anesthetic window. Need board authorization now. The typing indicator flared almost immediately. Nora Klein. Need full board on video in 20. Do not move him until vote. Then, Aaron Feld, legal. Retired bovine consult is useful, but not dispositive. Need specialist concurrence from boarded surgeon/radiologist in writing before any emergency laparotomy approval. Then, before Dan could answer either, Dr. Melissa Cho, Piedmont University Surgical Service. Can review films now. If surgical candidate, earliest OR window is tonight, 23:30 due storm staffing. Requires transfer by $2,000 and $28,000 guarantee at intake. Dan exhaled through his teeth. Tonight. Or maybe not for days. He forwarded Whitcomb's notes, Marta's statement, the collar photo, and the radiographs to Cho, then sent one line to the thread. Dan, clock is active. He is clinically declining. Delay increases mortality. His phone rang before anyone replied. Hargrove. Inspector, Dan said. We received your updated note about a magnet-related hardware aggregation, Hargrove said, skepticism pressing hard on every syllable. Where did that diagnosis originate? Consult plus corroborating husbandry history. We're sending supporting docs. I'm also looking at a third-party welfare complaint filed 30 minutes ago alleging your facility is preparing experimental surgery without appropriate specialty oversight. Dan closed his eyes. From whom? Complaint source is confidential. Ridgeway, he thought. Maybe not provable, but the timing was too clean. Hargrove continued. Given public concern and the animal's risk profile, the department expects tertiary referral if surgery proceeds. That's what I'm arranging. Then submit transport plan and receiving surgeon acceptance in writing before wheels roll. Before wheels roll, Dan repeated, looking through the treatment room window at Pairov, lying rigid, chin flat on concrete, eyes open but unfocused. We'll be watching this closely, Hargrove said, and hung up. By 9:41 a.m., Dan was in the conference room with a laptop, a whiteboard, and 7 faces tiled across screen squares from kitchens, offices, and 1 parked car. Board emergency quorum. Nora chaired from home, hair pinned tight, glasses low on her nose. Walk us through, she said. Dan did, fast and stripped down to facts. Metallic cluster on radiographs, chronic pattern, new decline, anorexia, retching, pain escalation. External consults suggesting magnet-centered aggregation, corroborating witness statements from former staff about magnets in feeding workflow. Recommendation: emergency abdominal surgery plus dental extraction under 1 anesthetic event. When he finished, there was a long silence filled only by somebody's dog barking through a hot mic. Board member Ellis spoke first. This sounds plausible, but it also sounds unprecedented. It is unprecedented for us, Dan said. Not impossible biologically. Nora leaned toward her camera. Do we have a boarded exotic surgeon agreeing with this mechanism? Pending review from Dr. Cho right now. Pending is not yes. Lena stepped into frame from Dan's side, still in scrubs. With respect, none of this becomes safer by waiting for perfect certainty. He is clinically worse today than yesterday. Another board member, Priya, asked, what happens if we do nothing for 24 hours? Lena didn't soften it. Continued pain at minimum, at worst, perforation, peritonitis, sepsis, catastrophic decline. Ellis rubbed his forehead. And if we cut? High anesthetic and surgical risk, Lena said, but it's a chance. Nora tapped her pen against a notebook. Financially, this commits us to reserves we don't have with no guaranteed outcome. Dan felt heat rise behind his ribs. He is not a line item. He is one tiger in a sanctuary of 38 carnivores, Nora shot back. My job is to keep all of them fed next month. Before Dan could answer, his laptop chimed with a new email from Dr. Cho. He opened it on screen. Radiographic pattern and history are strongly suspicious for retained magnetic foreign body with aggregated metallic debris, chronic. Given present clinical signs, I recommend urgent exploratory laparotomy. If patient survives induction and lesion is operable, concurrent dental extraction is reasonable to avoid repeat anesthesia. There it was, the specialty concurrence they wanted. Dan read it aloud. The board squares shifted, some relieved, some more alarmed now that the call was real. Nora said, all right, motion. Authorize emergency referral and surgery up to $30,000, conditional on fundraising bridge and legal waiver. Dan almost laughed from sheer relief. Then Ellis said, I can't support without CT first. We need imaging before open abdomen. Priya nodded, seconded. CT could prevent an unnecessary surgery. It could also kill him under prolonged anesthesia and still lead to surgery, Lena said. Vote was called anyway. The seventh trustee, the one calling in from a parked car, formally abstained after disclosing a donor conflict tied to Ridgeway-linked fundraising channels. 3 for conditional surgery, 3 for CT first. Tie. No authorization. For a second, Dan honestly didn't process the words. Tie meant no motion carried, no funds released, no transport clearance, no surgery path. Nora looked sick but formal. Without majority, administration cannot commit institutional funds. We reconvene at noon with more data. We don't have noon, Dan said. Then get me something that changes a vote. The call ended. Screen went black. Within minutes, Priya texted that she had to leave for a family medical emergency and went offline. With one trustee already recused, only 5 voting members were reachable, below the 6-member quorum required to reopen the motion. Lena swore softly beside him. Dan stood so abruptly his chair tipped backward and slammed into the wall. At 10:26, Pyrav retched again, harder this time, body folding around pain. Foam and streaks of brown-red fluid spattered the den floor. Malik's voice over radio was tight. Possible blood. Dan and Lena were running before the sentence finished. They couldn't risk full sedation just to examine him. They managed what they could through barriers and ports, antiemetic, analgesic adjustment, fluids, careful observation for shock signs. Bhairav staggered to his feet, took 2 steps, then stood braced with forelegs wide, breathing shallow. Every few breaths a tremor moved down his flank. Lena's jaw locked as she watched his abdomen. Guarding is worse. Dan crouched near the mesh and spoke low, useless comforts anyway. Pyrav's ears flicked once at his voice, then flattened. At 11:03, Dan called Nora again. No change in vote without quorum, she said. I'm trying to pull Ellis back in. Pyrav just vomited blood-tinged fluid. A pause. Document everything. I need approval, Nora. I need governance, Dan. He ended the call with his hand shaking. At 11:19, Dr. Cho called from Piedmont. I can hold the 2330 OR for now, she said, but not indefinitely. We have a GDV, Great Dane, in line and 2 equine emergencies weather-dependent. I need transfer confirmation and financial guarantee by 1500. Working on funding, Dan said. Do it quickly. If I release this slot, next availability, maybe 48 hours. 48 hours Pyrav likely didn't have. He launched an emergency donor appeal from his office computer himself, bypassing scheduled comms layers. Pyrav is in critical decline. We have a surgical team ready tonight if we can fund immediate transfer and operation. Within minutes, money started moving. $20, $50, $200, $3,000 from a name he recognized from a cougar rescue years ago. Then, just as quickly, another wave hit. Chargebacks, flagged transactions, coordinated comments alleging fraud. Their payment processor temporarily throttled incoming gifts for unusual activity. By 12:07, the dashboard showed they were still $9,000, short of what Nora said she'd need to justify an emergency bridge. Dan sat at his desk staring at the spinning refresh icon until the numbers blurred. He had built his whole adult life around crisis competence. Solve, reroute, move. But every route now had a gate with someone else's key. At 12:34, a text came from transport lead Jessa. Truck 2 throwing transmission code. In shop bay, of course it was. Truck 1 could haul the big cat crate, but only if they stripped non-essential gear and prayed through mountain switchbacks in rain. The storm front had already shifted from possible to severe watch by evening. By 1:10 p.m., Dr. Cho emailed a final warning. Need confirmation by 1500. Cannot reserve resources beyond that. At 147, no board majority. No full funds. One transport truck compromised. Pyrav still refusing all food. Setbacks stopped feeling like events and became weather. Continuous. Unavoidable. Cold. Dan went back to quarantine because spreadsheets were making him cruel. Lena sat alone on an overturned feed bin outside Pyrav's den, gloves peeled halfway off, elbows on knees. The corridor lights threw a hard yellow line across her face, carving fatigue into sharp planes. For once, she didn't look up when Dan approached. "Hey," he said. "Give me 10 minutes," she said quietly. "I need to not be useful for 10 minutes." He nodded and moved away without arguing. After he left, Lena pressed her palms against her eyes until sparks flared in the dark. She had trained herself for composure so long it felt like muscle memory. Assess, prioritize, intervene, chart. People mistook it for invulnerability. She had even encouraged the mistake. Calm vets got trusted, emotional vets got second-guessed. But beneath the calm sat an old private panic with a name. Nandi. A lioness at her first job, 12 years ago. Colic signs that came and went. Inconclusive films. Administrators demanding certainty before authorizing surgery because the animal was a high-value ambassador. Lena had waited for better imaging, better labs, better permission. Nandi crashed overnight from a perforation no one had wanted to believe in time. Lena still remembered the weight of that lioness's paw when she tried to intubate during a code that was already lost. She had left that facility 6 months later and never told anyone the full reason. Not the board-friendly version, not the legal version. The real one, she had let process outrank urgency and an animal paid in blood. Now Pyrav breathed in ragged, deliberate pulls 10 feet away, and the old fear was back in her mouth like metal. She heard Dan's boots approach again and didn't bother hiding the tears this time. They were quiet, angry tears, the kind that came from being outnumbered by systems. He stopped beside her. "Lena." "I waited once," she said, voice rough, "on a lioness, because people above me wanted cleaner probabilities. She died anyway, and everyone wrote, 'complex case,' and moved on." Dan sat on the concrete opposite her, back to the wall. "You never told me that." "I don't tell people things that sound like confession." She laughed once without humor. "I am very good at seeming steady while feeling like I'm splitting open." He didn't rush to fill the silence. She looked at him finally. "If we cut and he dies, I can live with being blamed. I can't live with pretending delay is caution if it's really fear." Dan's expressions softened in that way that always undid her more than touch. "I'm scared too." "Good," she said, wiping her face with the heel of her hand. "Because anyone who isn't scared before opening a tiger's abdomen is a liar." He gave a tired half smile. Then it faded. "There's another thing. If the board won't move, I may have to sign personal liability and go around them." "That could end your job." "Yeah." She studied him for a long second, saw the same thing she felt. Exhaustion braided with stubborn love for a difficult world. She had spent months, maybe years, keeping whatever this was between them inside professional lines, because rescue work ate relationships and left bones. But fear had burned through caution. "I'm not here because it's easy," she said. "I'm here because when you decide an animal matters, you don't flinch. That's rare. It's also infuriating." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. She leaned back against the wall, voice steadier now. "If you sign, I'm with you. Not because I think we're guaranteed to win, because I refuse to lose him by committee." Inside the den, Pyrav shifted and gave a low, painful grunt. Lena stood, pulled her gloves fully on, and became useful again. At 2:52 p.m., the day broke in the worst way possible. Hargrove called with another clipped, formal tone. "Mr. Fletcher, the department has issued a temporary transport hold pending review of your emergency referral paperwork and welfare complaint." Dan stopped walking. "A hold? On what basis?" "Administrative. You may continue supportive care on site. Do not move the animal off property until cleared." "Inspector, he has a tertiary OR slot tonight. Delay may kill him. Submit requested affidavits and await response." The line clicked dead. Dan stood in the corridor with the phone still at his ear while rain began ticking against the metal roof. He forwarded the hold notice to legal and Nora. Aaron replied in under a minute. "Do not violate. Penalties severe. Possible permit action." At 3:01, Dr. Cho called. Wind howled faintly through her end of the line. "I'm sorry, Dan. I need confirmation now. We just got a state transport hold. A beat. Can they lift it in an hour?" "I don't know." "Then I have to release the OR to the GDV. I can keep a standby team if your Tiger is en route by 2100, but no promise." "Understood," he said, though nothing about it was. When he hung up, he leaned his forehead against cinder block and let the anger move through him like current. Ridgway's complaint, state hold, board tie, payment interference, individually defensible, collectively lethal. At 3:18, quarantine radio crackled. Code amber on Pyrav, increased distress. Dan ran. Pyrav was down on his side now, not in resting posture but collapse. Hind legs rigid and forepaws flexing against the floor. His belly looked tighter, drawn. He lifted his head once when Lena knelt at the barrier, then dropped it hard. "Heart rate 140 and climbing," Malik said. "Mucous membranes tacky. He's crashing toward us." Lena looked up at Dan, rainwater dripping from his jacket onto concrete. "If this is perforation starting, supportive care won't hold him." Outside, thunder rolled across the ridge. Dan's phone vibrated with Nora's name. He answered on speaker. "We have 4 votes if Ellis joins in 10 minutes, she said. "Can you hold until then?" Lena's eyes never left Pyrav. "I can't promise 10 minutes, she said toward the phone. "I can't promise 5. Nora was silent a beat too long. "If you move him under hold, the state may come for your license." Dan looked from the Tiger on the floor to the printed transport hold in his hand, rain bleeding the ink at the edges where his fingers gripped too hard. Another thunder crack. Lights flickered once. On the radio, Jessa's voice cut in from the vehicle bay. "Truck 1 is loaded and ready if we go. Storm cell ETA 40 minutes before roads start flooding at mile marker 12. Everything converged into one narrow, brutal choice. Dan closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them to Lena's face. Drawn, fierce, waiting. Behind her, Pyrav gave a thin, strangled sound Dan had never heard from him before. And the clock kept moving. Dan looked at the transport hold, then at Pyrav on the concrete, and made the first clean decision he'd made all day. "Jessa," he said into the radio, voice level. "Roll truck 1 to quarantine now." Nora's voice snapped through speakerphone. "Dan, do not do this." He took the phone off speaker and held it close. "I'm invoking emergency veterinary necessity. You violate a state hold and they can close us. If I obey it, he dies on this floor." He swallowed hard. "I'll sign personal liability." "Dan," he ended the call. Lena was already moving. "Malik, prep transfer sedatives at half induction protocol. Jessa, thermal blankets, portable oxygen, crash kit. I want 2 IV lines before we load." Malik hesitated. "State hold?" Lena met his eyes. "I'll co-sign with Dan. Move." The team exploded into motion, Rain hammered the roof hard enough to drown out everything except the monitor and Bhairav's rough breathing. Dan sprinted to admin, grabbed the emergency liability packet from legal archives, and signed every line with shaking hands. Operational override, transport risk assumption, personal indemnity pending board review. He scanned and sent it to legal, Nora and Hargrove with one subject line: life-saving transport under immediate threat to animal welfare. Then he called Hargrove directly. The inspector answered on the fourth ring, already angry. "Mr. Fletcher, I told you to await." "Tiger is acutely decompensating. Bloody emesis, tachycardia, collapse. We are moving now under attending veterinary emergency order. Documentation sent." "You do not have authority to supersede a departmental hold." "Then send an officer to stop my truck in person while he's crashing and explain that on camera." Silence. Rain hissed across the line. Hargrove spoke again, colder. "If you leave, this becomes an enforcement action." Dan's jaw tightened. "Then enforce it after he's alive." He hung up and ran back to quarantine. They sedated Bhairav just enough to move him, not enough to steal the little cardiovascular margin he had left. Even half under, he was enormous in the crate, striped flank twitching with each pothole in his body. Lena rode in back with Malik, one hand on the pulse ox probe clipped to Bhairav's ear, the other bracing herself against every turn. Dan drove. Jessa sat shotgun with weather radar on a tablet and a paper map in case the signal died. At mile marker 9, rain became a wall. "Flood alert just popped," Jessa said. "Route 12 is red." Dan gripped the wheel. "Alternate?" "County 6 adds 22 minutes. "We don't have 22. In back, Lena shouted over the storm. "His sats are sliding. 91 now 88. Dan, smoother if you can." "I'm on a mountain road in a river," he yelled back, then immediately hated himself for it. Sorry. Lightning strobed the cab white. A fallen branch blocked half the lane ahead. Dan threaded around it with inches to spare, trailer fishtailing once before catching. The crate slammed. Bhairav let out a deep, involuntary moan that sounded like iron bending. "Pressure's dropping," Malik called. Lena's voice came sharper. "Push 10 mils. Start the second line. Come on, old man, stay with me." They hit the county line at 9:37 p.m., late but moving. Dan's phone buzzed non-stop in the cup holder. Nora, legal, unknown numbers, Hargrove again. He ignored all of it. At 10:12 they rolled under the awning at Piedmont University Veterinary Hospital, water pouring off the truck in sheets. A trauma team was already waiting with gurney rails and floodlights, Doctor. Melissa Cho in a lead apron over scrubs, hair braided tight. "You made it," she said. And then, seeing Bhairav's monitor, "Barely. Or now." Dan jumped down into ankle-deep runoff and helped lock the crate to the rolling platform. "State might call this unauthorized transport." Cho didn't look up from the line she was checking. "State can call me after we intubate." Inside, everything became bright, cold, and fast. Consent forms shoved at Dan, estimated mortality percentages spoken in clean, impossible numbers. Payment guarantee requested by admissions while Bhairav's heart rhythm stumbled on the monitor. Dan handed over his personal credit card and said, "Run it." "It may decline at this amount," the clerk warned. "Run it anyway." It approved. At 10:41 p.m., Bhairav disappeared through double OR doors. Dan and Lena scrubbed in as support because Cho's team was short one large carnivore anesthesia tech. The room smelled of chlorhexidine, cautery, and wet fur. Bhairav lay draped and immense under sterile blue, chest rising with mechanical precision. Cho made the first incision, deliberate and deep. Midline entry, she said. Suction. Minutes stretched like wire. Adhesions appeared almost immediately, dense bands of scar tissue tethering stomach to adjacent omentum. Old battles healed ugly. Cho worked through them with blunt dissection and patience that looked like diffusing a bomb. There, she said finally, voice tightening. I have it. The mass emerged in increments too big and jagged to lift cleanly at first. Metal glinted through tissue and fibrin, nails, staples, twisted wire, rusted slivers fused around a blackened cylinder the size of a thumb joint. Cho held it up for one stunned second. Neodymium magnet, corroded. No one spoke. Even the monitors seemed quieter. Bag it for evidence chain, Dan said hoarsely. They inspected for perforations. One shallow ulceration, no full-thickness rupture yet. Lucky by inches and years, Cho lavaged, checked viability, and nodded once. He can survive this if he survives tonight. Prep dental. Lena moved to Pyrav's head as the dental surgeon stepped in. The infected canine came out fractured, root rotten to the tip, pus draining under pressure. More flushing, debridement, local antibiotic beads. At 1:03 a.m., just as closure began, Pyrav's blood pressure crashed. 70 systolic and falling, Malik said. Vasopressor up, Cho snapped. Check for bleed source. No active hemorrhage obvious. Arrhythmia flickered across ECG. Lena was already at the airway, hands steady, voice clipped. He's cold and acidotic, warmed fluids now. Dan, blood products. Dan didn't move for half a beat. Then he was out the door, phone in hand, calling Blue Ridge's emergency donor Tiger Roster, the pre-screened internal blood donor program they had built for exactly this nightmare and prayed never to use. Their closest matched donor, a younger male named Raja, was 40 minutes away at a partner facility with on-call staff. Spin up collection, Dan told them. Courier to Piedmont Stat. I'll authorize transfer and police escort request. Escort, the text said. Ask County EMS Command. Tell them it's critical veterinary blood. He called in 3 favors in 6 minutes, including one deputy whose hound Blue Ridge had treated last year. At 1:49 a.m., the first cooler arrived, red and sloshing. They transfused. Pressure crawled upward. Rhythm steadied. Not pretty, but present. At 3:22 a.m., surgery ended. Pyrav was moved to ICU, still intubated, swaddled in warming blankets, lines taped and humming. Dan stood at the glass, scrubs stiff with iodine and sweat, while Lena adjusted the ventilator settings with the tenderness of someone handling cracked glass. At 4:11, Baharav coughed around the tube and tried to lift his head. Good sign, Lena whispered. Easy, easy. At 4:26, they extubated clean. By dawn, rain had thinned to mist. Pyrav was breathing on his own. Dan sank onto the ICU hallway floor with his back against the wall and mud drying on his boots. And for the first time in 36 hours, his hands stopped shaking. The fight wasn't over just because Pyrav was alive. At 7:02 a.m., while Dan was still in borrowed scrubs, his phone lit up with a notice from the department. Immediate inquiry regarding unauthorized transport and procedural non-compliance. Attached was a draft intent to suspend Blue Ridge's transfer privileges pending review. He read it once, then stood up. Lena, he said, I need every timestamp from last night. Vitals, interventions, emesis photos, everything. She looked up from Pyrav's charting. They're coming after us. They're trying. Back at Blue Ridge by noon, he walked into an emergency board meeting that felt more like arraignment. Nora sat at the head of the table, pale from no sleep. Aaron from legal had a stack of printed statutes and the expression of a man preparing for impact. Ellis spoke first, brittle with outrage. You defied a state hold. I overrode an administrative delay during active decompensation, Dan said. You exposed us to sanctions. I expose myself to sanctions. He slid signed liability documents across the table. That's my name, not yours. Nora held up a hand before Ellis could continue. State says you left before final review. Dan opened his laptop and pushed it around so everyone could see the screen. Time-stamped den camera footage of Peyrav collapsing, retching blood-tinged fluid, lying lateral. Concurrent monitor logs. Lena's clinical note marked immediate life-threatening deterioration. Transport departure time. Hospital intake time. If we waited for their callback, he would have missed OR, Dan said. OR that found exactly what we suspected. He clicked to the surgical photos. The fused metal bezoar, the corroded magnet, the extracted infected canine. No one spoke. Aaron cleared his throat. This helps, but department may still argue process. Then we give them process, Dan said. Full evidence packet, external specialist affidavits, and disclosure of interference. Nora looked up sharply. Interference? Dan projected logs from the donation platform. Coordinated fraudulent chargebacks clustered with social media attacks, many originating from accounts linked to a marketing contractor who had done outreach for Ridgeway Exotics. Then, he pulled up Ridgeway's time-stamped offer to assume custody emails copied to media before medical facts were public. Ellis frowned. You can't prove they filed the complaint. Not yet. But we can prove they exploited the crisis and amplified false claims in real time. Nora's mouth tightened. And if we go public with that? We don't lead with accusation, Dan said. We lead with records, medicine, timeline, outcomes. Let facts do the damage. At 2:30 p.m., Hargrove arrived in person with another inspector and a body camera clipped to his vest. He expected defensiveness. He got binders. Lena met them in conference with a projector already warmed. For the record, she said, I ordered emergency transport due to acute clinical decline. I accept professional responsibility for that call. Hargrove watched the footage, listened to audio timestamps, reviewed Cho's operative report, and paused longest over the image of the magnet wrapped in rusted hardware. You're telling me this sat in him for years, he said quietly. Yes, Lena said, until it didn't. Hargrove flipped pages, slower now. And the welfare complaint source claimed you were inventing a diagnosis for fundraising. Dan slid a final document forward. Independent chain of custody from hospital pathology confirming metallic foreign body aggregation around synthetic magnet core, with corrosion profiles consistent with chronic retention. Not invented, measured. Hargrove removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The transport hold was issued under incomplete information and escalating public pressure. Dan kept his voice even. Public pressure isn't a triage criterion. A muscle jumped in Hargrove's jaw. For a moment, Dan thought the inspector would double down. Instead, he said, We're rescinding the suspension notice pending final review. Pending? Ellis muttered. Hargrove looked directly at Dan. You took a high-risk action outside directive. Next time, call me before wheels roll. I did, Dan said. You told me to wait. Hargrove held his gaze, then gave a tight nod that was not apology, but close enough to truth to matter. Submit your full case report within 10 days. We may issue statewide advisory on metal ingestion screening. After he left, Nora sat down hard in her chair as if someone had cut her strings. We survived, she whispered. Dan shook his head. Bhairav survived. Now we earn the rest. That night, the ICU wing was dim except for monitor glow and the sodium yellow spill from the parking lot lamps. Bhairav slept under blankets, one forepaw flexing now and then in dreams. His breathing had lost the razor edge. When Lena offered him diluted broth on a sponge stick, he licked twice, then 3 times, then closed his eyes again. At 11:18 p.m., she stepped out into the corridor and found Dan by the vending machine, staring at a bag of pretzels like it had insulted him personally. "You haven't eaten," she said. He held up the pretzels. "I'm in active negotiations." She took the bag, bought it, and handed it back. Resolved. He laughed, small and tired. They sat on the floor against opposite walls at first, the old habit of professional distance still trying to govern a day that had blown past all rules. After a minute, Dan said, "I listened to your voice in that room when he crashed. You didn't sound scared." "I was terrified," she said. "I was just busy." He nodded, chewing without appetite. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing him because I waited for permission that never came." "You didn't wait at the end." "At the end." He stared down the hallway toward ICU. "I'm supposed to protect this place. Instead, I may have made us vulnerable." She shifted so her shoulder touched his. "You protected the part that matters." Silence settled, warm and fragile. Then Lena said, "I need to tell you something before exhaustion makes cowards of both of us." Dan turned to her. "I have spent 2 years keeping you at arm's length because I thought if we crossed that line, we'd wreck the work." Her voice shook once, then steadied. "Truth is, I was already wrecked by the work, and you were the person who made it feel possible anyway." He didn't speak, just listened, eyes fixed on her as if afraid to miss a word. "I love how you fight," she went on. "Not loudly, not for credit, just relentlessly. I love that you remember every cat's pacing pattern and every volunteer's kid's name. I love that when you're angry, it's usually because something vulnerable is being used as leverage." She smiled through sudden tears. "And I am done pretending that's not love." Dan let out a breath that sounded like a decade leaving his chest. "I've been in love with you since the day you screamed at me for skipping hydration during the Bobcat wildfire intake," he said. Lena blinked. "That was your romantic awakening? You were covered in ash and furious and absolutely right." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I kept telling myself not to say anything because this place eats people who make personal mistakes. But every crisis, I look for you first. Every good outcome, you're the one I want to tell before anyone else." She reached for his hand. He took it like it was both anchor and shock. "I don't want a secret half-life," he said quietly. "I want real, even if real is messy and on-call and interrupted by sedated hyenas." Lena laughed wetly. "That is extremely our brand." "I mean it," Dan said. "Not just tonight because adrenaline and relief are making everything sharp. Tomorrow too. And when the board is impossible, and when we lose one because we will. I want to do all of it with you." She leaned in until her forehead rested against his. "Then do it with me." He kissed her softly at first, cautious, then with the kind of certainty that had been waiting behind every almost moment for years. When they broke apart, they stayed close, fingers linked. From ICU came a low, rough sound. They both turned instantly. Pyrev was awake, eyes half open, looking toward the doorway. His tongue flicked once toward the empty broth cup. Then he gave a faint chuff, thin but unmistakable. Lena laughed, wiping her face. "He's timing this to make sure he remains the center of attention." Dan stood, pulling her up with him. "He's not wrong." They went back inside together. 3 weeks later, dawn fog hung low over Blue Ridge Quarantine Row again. Dan stood outside Bhairev's enclosure with a clipboard and fresh coffee, while Malik slid in a breakfast tray. Soft goat, fortified broth, medication hidden in liver paste. Peyrav padded out of his den slower than he once had, but without that old jaw-clamped misery. The swelling under his eye was gone. His coat had begun to shine again along the shoulders. He sniffed the tray, then ate. Not delicately, not bravely, just ate. Dan let out a breath and marked the chart. Across the yard, volunteers were setting up cameras for a press briefing. Not a rescue promo spectacle, Dan had insisted. An educational release. On a folding table under a canopy sat laminated radiographs, surgical photos, and a sealed evidence bag containing replicas of the removed hardware cluster for demonstration. The real mass was in state custody. At 9 sharp, Inspector Hargrove arrived in plain clothes, not uniform, and stood off to one side while Dan spoke. "We nearly missed this," Dan told the small crowd of local media, sanctuary directors and regulators. "Pre-op imaging caught it, history explained it, surgery removed it. The lesson is bigger than one tiger. Any former circus or roadside big cat with chronic GI signs should be screened for metal ingestion patterns, including possible magnetic retention." A reporter raised a hand. "Are you admitting prior negligence by your sanctuary?" Dan shook his head. "I'm admitting limits of what anyone can see without imaging and records. Then I'm showing what to do about it." After the briefing, Hargrove approached with a folder. "Department is issuing new guidance this afternoon," he said. "Mandatory independent enclosure audit documentation for facilities, transferring large carnivores, stricter feeding surface sanitation logs, and recommended radiographic screening protocol for high-risk intakes." Dan took the folder. "That's good." Hargrove hesitated. "State also opened neglect proceedings against Carson Wildlife Adventure and associated operators. Your documentation was persuasive." "Good," Dan said again, and this time it carried teeth. At noon, Nora gathered staff in the barn aisle for a financial update. She looked less armored than usual. "Crisis fundraising exceeded surgical costs by 21%, she announced. "Board has voted to establish a restricted emergency medical reserve, so we are never this close to paralysis again." Applause broke out, ragged but real. Nora found Dan in the crowd afterward and offered her hand. "I fought you," she said. "You protected the books. I forgot the books are for this." Her grip tightened once. "I won't forget again." Later, in the records office, Lena sat beside Dan at the old scanner while he finalized the case report for journal submission. Radiographs, operative details, pathology, timeline, husbandry implications. She read over his shoulder. "You're citing Whitcomb first in consult acknowledgements," she said. "He earned it." "And Marta." Anonymous former staff source corroborated by second interview. Lena nodded. "Good." He clicked submit and leaned back. Outside the window, Peyrav crossed his yard and stopped at the fence line nearest the service path. When Dan and Lena stepped out a few minutes later, he looked straight at them, whiskers forward. No flinch, no hollow-eyed withdrawal. He pressed one cheek lightly to a cedar post and scent marked, then huffed, a deeper chuff this time. The same morning hour, the same fog as the day Act 1 began. But no blood on Dan's sleeve, no helpless waiting. Just a tiger standing in his own weight again, alive enough to claim space. Lena slipped her hand into Dan's as they watched. "Easy, old man," Dan said softly through the mist. Peyrav blinked, finished his mark, and turned toward breakfast.